topic is that do emotions affect judgment? And that's our topic there. And I'll start off with a quick story around this. So for me, actually, I'll go back to last week and a half. So I'm driving down to Toronto from where I live. It's about an hour away. I went there to take my dad to a follow-up appointment with a specialist because he had fallen down a few weeks ago and he kind of broke his wrist inside and everything. I'm going for that appointment. I go to there to pick him up and we're meeting with a specialist and I pick him up. I go and find out where the appointment is, and as I enter it on the computer, it says there are no appointments. I'm like, what? I just drove from an hour away. There are no appointments, and I'm looking at it, I'm thinking about it. Then I talked to the receptionist there, and I talked to her. She's like, "Oh, we had sent a letter saying that this was moved." And I'm like, "Oh, now I'm thinking, like my dad had sent me a couple of letters. I actually haven't read it properly." So I'm looking through my phone. I'm like, oh, this letter. She's like, yeah, it's bold in red saying that, oh, it's, I didn't read the letter properly because I was busy and I was looking at it. But so two things happened there. I'll come back to the letter part. I'm like, okay, let's leave. I go and drop off my dad. I go upstairs to my parents' place and we have some breakfast and I leave. As soon as I leave, I can't find my wallet. My wallet is gone. And I'm like, what the hell? And I'm looking everywhere. I'm calling my parents, like, can you look for it? And I pretty much had all my cards in my wallet. I couldn't find my wallet. I drove back. I went there for about 2.5, 3 hours, no appointments. I lose my wallet. And now I'm sitting there trying to figure out, I got to get all my cards and stuff. Fast forward to till a couple of days ago, I got all my cards and everything back. I never found my wallet. And I kind of reflected back as to what happened. So a couple of things happened. One, I didn't look at the letter properly because I was dealing with a lot of stuff and we had just moved and I was a little bit overwhelmed. I didn't have enough space to think. And so I never checked with the appointment. I drove about an hour and a half, an hour there, an hour back. And on top of that, the fact I haven't lost my wallet. I think the last time I had lost the wallet, if I remember, maybe like 15 years ago. And I'm thinking like, okay, why did I lose my wallet? I wasn't present, to be honest. I was trying to juggle too many things at once. And I was like, okay, I can take care of this. And I know that because I wasn't present, likely I didn't feel the wallet properly in my pocket. And I didn't notice it when I was coming out of the car, I dropped it. Now you can say that, well, a lot of people can make that mistake. That might be true. But just reflecting back on my own experience, there was too much going on internally for me. So I wasn't paying attention. I was just trying to move through my day-to-day stuff. I was going through the motions, like a lot of people might say. It's very easy for me to look back at that experience. It was just an accident. Oh, and then, but there were so many things happen leading up to that. I was dealing with a lot of things the past couple of weeks because we recently moved and I didn't have a lot of space to give myself to think and process a lot of that stuff. And even during that day, I was dealing with a lot of things and accidents happen. Accidents, not like accidents in terms of people being in danger, but accidents in the sense that I made mistakes. And a lot of those mistakes were my lack of presence and lack of focus in my life. And what was happening was that internally there was something else that was taking up a lot of space. As I reflected back, I realized there was so much going on in there that I wasn't dealing with. So the reason why I'm sharing this incident with you guys is that it's very easy to write off incidents in our life saying that, oh, that just happened, but how much of it is our own part in there? And that's what I want to go into in our topic around emotions and judgment, which is that do emotions affect judgment, our decision-making ability, and what happens in our day-to-day life? I think back to when I was younger, when I got into driving, for example, I used to get into all sorts of accidents. Now, fingers crossed, I haven't gone to any accidents for the past 16 years or so. There was one incident, somebody else hit me from the back. That was an actual incident. But beyond that, I haven't. But when I was younger, I was getting into accidents all the time. Now, you might say, well, I didn't have enough skill sets around driving. I remember what I used to do. I'd be excited to get in the car and I'm like showing off to people and I'm like jumping around and I'm like, trying to race people. I would be thinking about other things. I wouldn't pay attention to driving. That would be the last thing I would pay attention to. And I would get into accidents. Or I'd be careless about something, or I'd be thinking about something else, or I came out of an argument. Now, I want you to think about think about moments that you've kind of come out of, for example, a challenging situation in your relationship. It could have been with a spouse or with your boss or with your business partner where you had an argument or something, and you can't think about anything to save your life. You can change your focus, like I'm gonna focus on, but you can feel the heaviness. Has anybody felt that heaviness in their life? And the reason why I'm pointing that out is that emotions take up a lot of bandwidth internally for us, and we don't realize the impact of that in our thinking. And that's what I want to go into is that there are two competencies that we need to be aware of, and these are actually internal competencies. One is emotional regulation, and the other one is decision making. And both of these are competencies. And while you can develop the competencies separately, they both interconnect with each other. And I want to go into emotions a little bit. What are emotions? This is very, very important for us to understand. So our emotions are the effect of physiological and psychological responses to a stimulus. It could be internal, like our own thought processes. It could be our own past stuff that has happened. It could be other things that we are impacted by, like we run into a person who is really rude, or we had an argument, and that impacts our thinking and other things. And then now all of a sudden we're overwhelmed with something that we call emotions. And all it is that there's something in our body that's requiring our attention. And it's physiological, it's psychological. So it literally impacts our heart rate, it impacts our hormones. So it's not like something that we can just ignore. Now, here's the challenge. A lot of people ignore it. So a lot of people have, and we have this ability as a human being that we can just change our focus. We can say, well, I'm just going to focus on this thing. The problem is that your subconscious mind is trying to work through that in the back. And while that's doing that, it's taking up a lot of space. This is why there have been studies down and for people who drive, like driving studies, where people who've kind of gone out of an argument or they're dealing with a challenge, that actually impairs their judgment and driving very similar to if they were under the influence or very similar of a drug or something or very similar to if they didn't have enough sleep. That impairs judgment. There are so many incidents where people are just driving through and they're in thought and emotion, they will go right through the red light, not because of any other factor other than their own internal processes. So we understand enough to know that it takes up internal bandwidth. Now, I want to make a distinction between feelings versus emotions. Feelings are inherent to every human being. Every human being will feel on we call it the positive, but on the one side of the spectrum, we can feel joy, connection, excitement, we can feel exhilaration, all those kind of. On the other side of the spectrum, we can feel fear, we can feel anger, we can feel frustration. None of those are positive, or we say it in language, we call it negative and positive. They're just different spectrums of the human experience. Now, where it becomes actually negative, and you might have heard this statement, a lot of people will say this, don't be emotional and don't make decisions when you're emotional. But what are they referring to? It's not clear what they're referring to a lot of times. So, for example, today in the news, there was a big news, like there was one big bank went out of business. So people in the real estate, they know about this Silicon Valley Bank. It went out of business. It started with one panic and then it just went out of control. In fact, actually, when you look at the bigger, when economy goes into recession, it's actually a big collective panic that ends up happening. People start to pull out their money from certain places, or people change what they invest in. Whatever happens, it's actually people reacting to their emotions. And most people will just look at that and they will just go into panic mode, especially if you're involved in that business. Now, I know one of my business partners, his spouse had some money invested in that bank. So that affected him directly. And it's very easy to kind of get pulled into that. So this has a tangible effect on our life. So the difference between feelings and emotions is emotions usually we react to either our past, a reaction to our past experience that has happened. Oh my God, in 2008, something happened. This looks similar to that. Let me just make the decision before this goes to crap. But we're reacting to past. We don't have any other data based on whatever we had heard from other people or whatever had happened in our life. We do this in relationship. For example, if we had a bad relationship in our past, we will talk to a new person. We're about to get into a new relationship. We're looking at this person with the lens of a past relationship. So we're not reacting emotionally to this person. We're actually reacting to a past incident. in our life. We're not aware of it in the moment. We're just doing that. We're assessing, like, some people, let's say if you're cheated on in a relationship or where somebody broke your trust, you will look at this person with a sense of, hey, I don't know if I trust this person, but it has nothing to do with this person's character. It has to do with how you were treated or how you felt in the last relationship. I've seen this in business as well. Is like there are entrepreneurs who don't trust a lot of people. When you ask them what it is, it's like, oh, I've been burned so many times. I don't trust a lot of people. But they've never worked out the emotional responses that they have in relation to that experience. So their emotions are reactive to a specific context, not necessarily to the general feeling that human beings go through, like the spectrum of emotions. So which means that anger in itself is not a negative emotion. Like if your space is violated and you feel angry, that's a good thing. That's in reaction to present. But an emotion is in reaction to what might have happened and you haven't resolved it yet. And that's a very subtle distinction in there, but a lot of what we react to is either our past or other people's effect on us, influence on us. So this is something to remember, is that as soon as emotions come into the picture, on the positive or negative, it has an influence on our decision-making ability. Now, there are different influences. So, for example, if you feel a lot of fear, you might step back. Like we know that in the real estate world right now, a lot of people are not making the decision to invest or buy something because they're scared. They go into contraction. If you feel excited, the effect is that you might just jump in. You're less risk averse. Either way, there's a big influence there. So it's not that you should or you shouldn't make decision based on those emotions. It's being aware of what is the effect of these emotions on your own decision making ability. And understanding that will help you make better decisions for your own life, because only you know how much you're affected by fear, by frustrations, anger, all that stuff, and how much are you affected by excitement, enthusiasm, and all that stuff. It has different effects for different people. So what we're talking about is you understanding your own system. So the part about the competency that's related to that is called emotional regulation. So in my experience and what I've seen is usually better decisions are made when we actually process the emotions. So what that means is that you give yourself the space to work through it. Now, part of it is space, part of it is do you have the tools? Because what ends up happening is if you make a decision, whether on the enthusiasm side or on the fear side, there's an extreme influence on you, and you might not be able to engage the part of your brain that can make better decisions, which is our prefrontal cortex. So that doesn't mean that emotions inherently are negative, it's that how the influence is showing up. So what does emotional regulation mean? It means that, are you giving yourself time to feel whatever you're feeling? It could be a few minutes, it could be a few hours, it could be a whole day. That's why a lot of people, when you go into the finance world as you're managing your money, they'll tell you, like, if you're about to spend, wait at least 24 hours and see what you feel the next day. A lot of people will spend because of their emotions. Most people make decisions based on emotions, not based on logic. And this is very important for us to understand around that. This, how do you regulate your own emotions? Now, do you have consistent practices for that? We all can move off of our practices just like I did with my example, but consistently, do we have practices that help us regulate emotions? That means, do we have the space and do we have the tools, such that could be more mindfulness stuff, that could be walks in nature, that could be you breathing, that could be you just being aware of your body, that could you exposing yourself things that bring calm and peace. There could be a lot of tools you can explore, but do you have a system? And systems are usually better than once in a while dealing with it, which means that on a day-to-day basis, you have a system to deal with your own emotions, because you can't control what happens in the bigger economy or with other people or even with your spouse or children or anybody else, but you can control your own reaction to that, which means, are you actually, do you have a system for dealing with that? And if you don't, this might be a place to think about what are those tools. That tool could be exercise, it could be mindfulness stuff, it could be you being in nature, it could be time for journaling, whatever you pick. There are so many tools you can pick from. Now, the other one I want to go into is the second part that I talk about. The second competency is around decision making. Now, I want to create a distinction around that. We actually technically use two different parts of our brain to do these things. So decision making, and there's only one exception, I would say. If a decision making requires a life or death situation, that needs to be instantaneous. For example, if a bus is coming towards you, you're not sitting there and analyzing the pros and cons. It actually, if a bus is coming towards you, your mind is going to engage your hindbrain, which actually connects to emotions, heightened emotions of fear, or the negative spectrum that gets you out of the way much quickly versus you just thinking about it in that moment. But what we're talking about is like business decisions, decisions to stay with somebody or not, decisions to move your life in a certain direction. Like these things don't require like quick decisions in the moment. It requires you to pause, slow down, and really feel and think through. Those decisions actually require our prefrontal cortex as long as we understand it. It's likely a combination of the two, but you need to be much more engaged with the conscious part of your brain or your mind, however you want to think about it. That is a skill set. That is a competency. Most people have a hard time thinking, not because they don't have the capacity to think, they just haven't put enough time to think. It's a muscle. That means that you're actually spending time working through problems. This is part of the reason why I think one thing that's really positive around understanding math and science in school is that it helps you think. It's not more about solving specific problems. It actually helps you, forces your mind to think and develop that competency. And so that's very important, which means have you exercised that part of your brain enough? Have you jumped into enough situations where you need to make decisions? And do you give yourself space to do that? And that's where I would say there are two things in there. One is intentionality, and the other one is space to think. Intentionality means that whatever decision, whatever situation you're putting yourself into, for example, you're about to have a conversation with your spouse or with your child or with your boss or with your business partner. Do you understand the intention behind that conversation? Or did you hear something and you're jumping into the conversation, or you're like, okay, I need space to process this and let me think about what is the purpose of this conversation? What is the purpose of this time? And most people don't do that. It's something common sense, but most people don't think through, like, what am I trying to achieve? What is the outcome of this? So most people will jump into situations, for example, with their spouse, they don't know the outcome. So instead of trying to create the space for both of them to resolve something, it becomes a space for who wins the argument, who's right and who's wrong. That it's a completely different intention around that. But because we're not aware of it, we go in that direction. And so, what is the space to think? So, our mind actually needs the space to think. In fact, there are people, some of the best influencers, that thinkers, they will actually give themselves daily or weekly time to think. Like they'll give themselves 40 minutes, an hour to just sit there and think about a specific problem. This builds that part of their mind. And that's a practice, that's a system. So they don't just hope that they will have the ability to think, they give themselves the space to think. That means that for you, that could be journaling time. For you, that could be time away for a weekend and work through your vision, work through your plan. It could be in different contexts will require different things, but do you actually have space to think in your calendar? Like when you're looking at throughout the day, do you literally have the space to sit down and work through some of the things? And I know that whenever I haven't had that space, I tend to make much more mistakes in business. I tend to make much more mistakes in my personal life. I tend to be much more erratic and reactive, just like I shared in the beginning of this call. And I wanted to share with that is because we all make those mistakes. So, and that's the difference between being intentional versus reactive. That I have time to regulate my emotions, but I also have the space to actually think about this problem and come up with solutions. And when you give yourself that space to feel and think, the next step might be is, hey, maybe I need support with this thing. Or the next step might mean that, no, I need to make a decision around this to move forward. But that comes out of those practices. So I want to summarize this. Do emotions affect judgment? I would say certainly, definitely. And on whether you're on the positive or the negative side of the spectrum, they influence you. Now, it's our job to think how much does that influence exist. For different people, it'll be different. But what's more important is, do you have the tools and the time to regulate those emotions on a consistent basis? And do you give yourself the space to actually think and develop intentions around different major parts of your life? Because if you're not, I can bet you're just reacting to other people's thoughts and emotions or your own past or whatever is happening in your life. And this is for you to think about.